Hey and welcome. This is Rob Konrad from Switzerland. There are tragedies in life that seem so overwhelming and so impossible and so unlikely and so cruel that makes you wonder how anyone affected could ever possibly recover. And yet there are some amazing and extraordinary people who not only do recover, but somehow manage to find forgiveness and love and become stronger and manage to become happy again. And today's guest is such an extraordinary person because her story is one of incredible tragedy, but it's also a story of and an inspiration for exactly this kind of strength and hope. In February of 2007, Charity Lee's 4-year-old daughter, Ella, was murdered. Not only murdered, but murdered by her own brother, Charity's 13-year-old son, Paris. Charity is here with me today, and we'll talk about how she was able to find hope and happiness in the 11 years this has happened, how she found forgiveness and love, and how the Ella Foundation that she started in the name of her daughter is helping victims of trauma and violent crimes and mental illnesses. So I want to thank you for taking the time and thank you for sharing your story, Charity Lee.
Good to be here. Thank you. I'm being attacked by a cat right now. Hold on. Okay. It's good to be here.
So, Charity, next February it will be 12 years since Ella passed away. So how are you today?
Today I'm okay. February 4th, 2007 was the day she died. So yes, February 4th, it'll be 12 years. I think about it. I have started to think about it, but I don't really dwell on it till about a month before the event. One of the ways that I have found to cope with this kind of tragedy and trauma is to try to, be as present in the moment I have in front of me. Mm-hmm. It's taken a long time to be able to do that, but it does help. And now, as opposed to the past, say the first, I don't know, it took a good 6 or 7 years to not be completely overwhelmed on anniversaries. But for the past 4 or 5 years, it's like the dynamic has shifted. Instead of the anniversaries owning me or taking over me, I've kind of taken over the anniversaries, and I try to do something to honor Ella on those days.
So what is that you do in those days?
Different rituals, I guess, for different anniversaries, because in my mind, the two big ones are always the day she was born and the day that she died. Mm-hmm. So on the anniversary of the day she died, which is the one coming up, and I do this for her birthday also, the mental process I go through is this. It's just a different timeline. For some reason, usually around 24 hours before the anniversary, whether it be death or birthday, I start thinking, like I'll look at the clock. Mm-hmm. And it's like I start to do a mental countdown, like, well, this time 12 years ago, like especially like on the day that she died, we were doing this. And this time 12 years ago, according to what my son tells me, is about the time that he decided to kill her. And then when it gets to the time that, we know that Ella died, that's when the majority of the pain comes in on that day. But then on her birthday, I stop and I think, oh, this is the time that I went into labor. And oh, this is the time that I just wanted somebody to shoot me because it hurt so bad. And this is the time that I saw her for the first time. And so it's kind of the opposite process, but they're both, sad and overwhelming. So on her Death Day, what I used to do when we were still living in Texas, when I was still living in Texas, was, in the Hispanic culture, they have Dia de los Muertos, which is in November. But what they do is, they build altars and they light candles and they set out food as a way to, because they believe on that day their loved ones come back and, they have a day on earth and they can commune with them. So on her death date, that's what I would do. I would build her an altar and light her candles. I still have the candle from her memorial service. I light it, one day a year on that birthday, and I try to honor her memory that way. Now, more recently, in the past 3 or 4 years, I will normally try to roll out a new program through the foundation on her anniversary days, whether it be a death day. I'll try to, not always, but try to have a new program ready to debut. This year, I think we're going to try to have a new program ready. I'm working on a couple, but we'll just have to see how it goes. And then also, now that I have a 5-year-old, he doesn't participate in the death day rituals. He usually goes with his grandmother on those days. But he definitely participates in the birthday rituals, because on the birthdays, I still have her a cake made that says "Happy Birthday, Ella," whatever age she would be. I write her a letter. Imagine, like, I would be saying to her at that particular age this year. She would be, 17? I'm sure I would be telling her to stay out of trouble. Please stay out of trouble. So, you develop your rituals to deal with the trauma, or one should develop rituals. Rituals help keep us sane.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe for those who are not familiar with the backstory or the story that the tragedy that has happened in 2007, could you explain your own words what happened on that day?
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, on February 4th, 2007, I had gone to work, and I had a babysitter who was at home with my children, and she left early. And my son, who was 13 years old at the time, murdered his sister. He beat her and choked her and ultimately stabbed her 17 times, and then called 911 and turned himself in.
Okay. And what was the reason that he did that?
The reason he gave then, or the reason we know now? Or both?
Both, I guess.
Yeah. The reason he gave at the time, like immediately at the time on the 911 call, is he said that he essentially had a psychotic break and was hallucinating and thought that she was being attacked by some sort of demon, and he was trying to save her, and then at some point he realized that it was Ella, but that all turned out to be a lie, and it was quite different than that. Now, what we know is that, in a nutshell, he wanted to kill somebody, and he wanted to hurt me. His original plan was to murder us both,
Mm-hmm.
But he told me later that he realized after killing his sister that it was much harder than he thought it would be to murder somebody, not mentally or emotionally, but physically harder to murder somebody than he realized. And since he and I were about the same size at that time, since he was just 13, he was worried that he wouldn't be able to kill me and he would be the one who was hurt. So he realized at some point, and this is all from conversations that Paris and I have had. I'm not like putting words into his mouth. This is things he's told me. He realized at some point that if he let me live, he told me basically, he was like, I knew, Mama, if I killed you, you would suffer for about 15 or 20 minutes. But if I let you live, you would suffer for the rest of your life.
And why did he want to make you suffer?
That's a really good question. Paris, there were things that I had done as a mother. When I was a teenager, I had drug addiction issues and had been sober for 12 years. 11 and a half years or so. Well, let me tell you, I hadn't had any problems with addiction for 11 and a half years. But when he was about 11 and a half years old, maybe 12 years old, I relapsed for a 6-month period of time. And he was justifiably, very angry about that. He, had a really good mom for 11 and a half years. And then all of a sudden, he had this mom who it was quite traumatic for him, I'm sure. But, he has since admitted that he had his first homicidal thought around the age of 8 years old, mm-hmm. which is, around the time his sister was born. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we really understand enough about people like Paris to know why they want people to suffer, other than it seems to be their preference. And, he thought that he had issues with me, or he did have issues with me, because and I have some reasons, but even when you have a reason like that, you're still just like, but why? Why did it have to be this way? Why did it have to be your sister? Especially 12 years later, looking back on it, I know a lot more about his mental state of mind, his emotional limitations. But unless we think that way, there's only so far I can go in explaining it before I too get to why. Why?
So Paris has been diagnosed in the meanwhile with schizophrenia?
No. He has no diagnosis of schizophrenia. The general consensus, he has not been formally diagnosed as an adult because we started to have testing done when he was an adolescent, mm-hmm. but he shut the testing down when the results started coming back showing that he has all the characteristics of someone with a diagnosis of anti-personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. In layman's terms, and Paris and I both, we agree on this, don't necessarily like the term, because when you say it makes people think it narrows down what people think about him. But in layman's terms, he is a sociopath.
A sociopath. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're still in touch with Paris on a regular basis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I found most surprising when I first heard about your story was that you've forgiven your son and you love your son.
Very much.
So for something as terrible as this to happen, it seems surprising that you can say you still love your son, because he no, obviously what he did was the most terrible thing that he could do to you, and he did so intentionally. So it wasn't in a fit of drug-induced rage or something. He planned to do it, and he did so intentionally. So did it take long for you to love him, or did you stop loving him at some point when this happened, or was it just a motherly love that just continued? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I never stopped loving him. Now, was that difficult some days? Yes, it was very difficult, very many days, and it still is sometimes. He is not an easy person to deal with. Well, he's a sociopath, and he's a narcissist. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, even just dealing with a narcissist and a narcissist alone is very difficult, because everything's about them, me, And then he has these, sociopathic tendencies on top of it. And I mean, there are days, and there have been months at times, where I'm like, you know what, kiddo, I love you, but I'm taking a break. Like, I need some space mentally to deal with you, or to build up the strength again to deal with you, especially when he was younger after he had committed the murder. But I didn't ever stop loving him, no matter how much rage, and there was a lot of rage. He was always my son first. And when Paris was born, I made him a promise that I would love him no matter what. And that I would always do the best I could to be the best mom I could to him. Now, obviously I wasn't able to always keep that second part of the promise, because I did relapse. And parents do make mistakes, and they don't always do what's best for their child. Even, a parent of an average kid may. It came to the loving part. I grew up feeling that the love my parent had for me was very conditional. Mm-hmm. And so I was determined that my child was not going to grow up with that feeling. And so when he murdered his sister, I thought about all the times that I screwed up as a kid. And I mean, in some of my screw ups, obviously I never killed anybody, but I came pretty close to killing myself more than once. And, I thought about how much I needed didn't necessarily agree with me, but I knew it had my back. So that's what I wanted to be for Paris.
Okay. Sorry, I just lost you there for a second. The connection dropped a bit. Okay. After you talk about the unconditional love that you want to give him, could you repeat what you last said?
Yeah, I didn't really feel like I got that growing up. So I became determined that that's what I was going to give my child. Mm-hmm. I made a promise to him. And I mean, for me, people ask me all the time, like, how did you do it? How do you do it? And I kind of am like, well, how do you not? That's my baby. I carried him in my body. I, was there with him for 13 years. Even when I relapsed, I was still struggling to be a mother, And it's just like, how could you not? As a parent, the way that I think about parenting is you don't have a baby and say, well, I'm going to love you as long as you do A, B, and C. But if you do this, that's it. I'm just turning off that love. That's just not how it worked for me. And the love that I have for my children, all three of my children, it's very fierce and it goes very, very deep. And, there was also the fact that, like, I am his mother. And yes, I was his victim also. But he was still my child. He was still my baby, my firstborn, deeply loved him and felt connected to him, still do. And I was the adult. I was his mother, and he was 13 years old. He was still a child. He needed a mother. He needed a parent. Now, I had to deal with the rage. I certainly had rage. But I tried to, as best I could, not take it out on him. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't know how angry I was or he didn't know my feelings on the matter. I've always been a very honest and blunt person with my children and the people in my life. But it meant not, taking it out on him in an inappropriate way. I have a story I always tell. There was one time I went to go visit Paris, and this was before he was sentenced. The investigation was still ongoing. We were still learning things about the fact that what he did was intentional. Like, it wasn't like things were getting any better, things were getting worse. And in the room next to us was a girl. She was maybe 15 or 16 years old, and she had gotten a visit from her father, and he was just, he was yelling at her, and he was calling her all these horrible names that I would never call my child, and just talking to her like she was a piece of trash. And all she had done, and it's okay, but all she had done was skip school and smoke some pot. Mm-hmm. And he was yelling so loud, he was like interrupting our visit, and I finally just couldn't take it anymore. And I was like, I got up and I walked over there to their little visitation room. And I was like, would you please just shut up and quit talking to your daughter that way? She skipped school and smoked some pot. Big deal. Does she need, big deal. I'm like, I'm trying to have a visit with my child. And I went and I sat back down, and I remember thinking, and how am I not yelling at Paris like this? Because I certainly have every right to do so.
Here comes the sunshine and burns away clouds like they never were.